I remember the exact moment I first smelled it, that sickly sweet fragrance that made my stomach turn and my mouth water at the same time. It was like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic, something that reminded me of the coins I handled every day as a traveling merchant. The scent hit me as I crested the hill overlooking the border between Limgrave and Caelid, and I should have turned back then. I should have listened to the way my horse Ember snorted and pawed the ground beneath us, her ears flattening against her skull as if she could sense something I couldn't yet comprehend. My name is Mira Ashworth, and I've been hauling goods between settlements in the lands between for the better part of 15 years. Started when I was barely 18, after my father's smithy burned down in one of those raids that seemed to happen every few months back then. The roads were dangerous, sure, but they offered freedom that a woman like me couldn't find anywhere else. I'd learned to read the signs, which paths to avoid when the tarnished were hunting, where to find water that hadn't been poisoned by whatever corruption was spreading through the land, how to tell when a site of grace had been desecrated by those who served darker powers. But nothing had prepared me for Caelid. The commission had come from a desperate village elder in eastern Limgrave. They needed medical supplies, specifically preserving salts and clean bandages that could only be found in the ruins near Fort Redmayne. The pay was 3 times what I'd normally charge for such a journey, enough to keep me comfortable through the coming winter. The elder's hands shook as he pressed the coin purse into my palm, and his eyes held that haunted look I'd seen in too many faces lately. The look of someone who'd watched people they loved succumb to something beyond their understanding. "My daughter," he'd whispered, clutching my wrist with surprising strength. "The sickness took her yesterday. Started as just a small cut on her finger from helping with the harvest, but it spread so fast in the color." He'd shuddered and released me. "Please, others are showing the signs now. We need those supplies before it's too late." I'd seen sickness before, of course. The lands between were full of plagues and curses, each more horrific than the last, but there was something in the old man's voice, a particular terror that made me accept the job despite every instinct screaming at me to refuse. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was the way his daughter's name, Rosalie, reminded me of my own sister, lost to the chaos years ago. Or maybe it was just the merchant's curse, the inability to turn down a profitable venture, no matter how dangerous. The journey to the border had been uneventful enough. Ember and I followed the familiar paths through Limgrave's rolling hills, past the ruins of churches where the faithful once prayed to the Golden Order. The Erdtree's light still reached these lands, though it seemed dimmer than I remembered from my childhood. The grace that once flowed freely through these regions now felt tainted somehow. Not absent, but changed, as if something else was mixing with the golden radiance that had once blessed all life in the lands between. As we approached the border, I noticed the vegetation changing. The grass grew sparse and took on a reddish tinge, as if someone had mixed rust into the soil. Trees that should have been green and healthy showed patches of crimson on their bark, weeping some kind of viscous sap that attracted swarms of flies unlike any I'd ever seen. These insects were larger than normal, with an almost metallic sheen to their wings, and they moved in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, as if they were following some kind of intelligence. It was while studying one of these strange fly swarms that I first cut my hand. I dismounted to examine what looked like a merchant's cart abandoned by the roadside, hoping to salvage anything useful or perhaps learn what had happened to its owner. The cart's wood was warped and discolored, covered in the same red sap I'd noticed on the trees. As I reached for what appeared to be an intact medicine pouch, a splinter of the corrupted wood pierced the palm of my right hand, just below my thumb. The pain was immediate and sharp, but what struck me as odd was how the wound immediately began to bleed more than it should have. The blood wasn't quite the right color either. Instead of the deep red I expected, it had an almost pinkish hue, and it seemed to shimmer slightly in the Erdtree's fading light. I pressed a clean cloth against the cut and bound it tightly, chalking up the strange color to a trick of the light, or perhaps contamination from whatever had affected the cart. That's when the smell hit me again, stronger this time, that sickly sweet fragrance that made my mouth water even as it turned my stomach. I looked around, trying to identify the source, and that's when I saw Caelid spread out below me for the first time. The land was red. Not the healthy red of autumn leaves, or even the rust red of iron ore. but a deep, organic crimson that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. What had once been fertile farmland and forest was now a sprawling wasteland of twisted vegetation and corrupted earth. Massive mushrooms the size of buildings dotted the landscape, their caps glowing with an eerie bioluminescence. Rivers that should have run clear were the color of blood, and the very air above the region seemed to shimmer with heat despite the cooling evening temperature. But it was beautiful, in its way. Terrifyingly, seductively beautiful. The crimson growths created patterns across the landscape that were almost artistic, like some mad god had decided to paint the world in shades of infection and decay. And despite everything my rational mind told me about the danger ahead, I found myself drawn to it, eager to see what other wonders this corrupted paradise might contain. Ember whinnied nervously as I remounted, and I patted her neck reassuringly. "Just a quick trip," I murmured to her, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "In and out with the supplies. We'll be back in Limgrave by tomorrow evening." As we began our descent into Caelid proper, I noticed that the bandage around my hand had already soaked through with blood. The cut was still bleeding freely, which was unusual for such a minor wound. I made a mental note to clean and redress it properly when we made camp for the night, but for now, I was too focused on the journey ahead to worry about such a small injury. The sun was setting as we crossed what I assumed was the official border into Caelid, marked by a crumbling stone archway covered in the same red growth I'd been seeing. The sweet smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Ember's hooves squelched slightly in the soft earth, and I realized with growing unease that what I'd taken for mud was actually some kind of organic matter. Decomposed vegetation mixed with something that looked disturbingly like flesh. That night, as I made camp in what appeared to be a relatively clean clearing, I finally took a proper look at my injured hand. What I saw made my blood run cold. The small cut had already begun to fester, but not in any way I'd ever seen before. Instead of the yellowed pus I might have expected from an infected wound, the edges of the cut were lined with tiny red growths that looked almost like miniature flowers. They pulsed gently with their own rhythm, and when I touched one with a fingertip, it felt warm and almost soft, like living tissue. The smell of sweet decay was stronger here too, and as I sat by my small campfire, I began to realize with growing horror that it was coming from my own hand. The fever started during the third hour of my watch that night. At first, I dismissed it as exhaustion from the journey, but as the crimson growths around my wound began to spread up my forearm like delicate veins beneath my skin, I knew I was dealing with something far beyond ordinary infection. The red lines traced beautiful patterns across my flesh, branching and flowering in ways that reminded me of the illuminated manuscripts I'd seen in the Academy of Raya Lucaria. Each new tendril brought with it a warm, tingling sensation that was almost pleasant, like being caressed by invisible fingers. When dawn broke over Caelid, the landscape revealed itself in all its corrupted glory. What darkness had mercifully hidden the night before now stood exposed under the sickly light of morning. The sky itself seemed wrong. Instead of the natural blue I was accustomed to, it held a reddish tinge, as if the very air had been stained with blood. The massive fungi I'd glimpsed from the border were even more imposing up close, some towering hundreds of feet into the air, their caps dripping with the same viscous substance I'd encountered on the merchant's cart. Ember refused to drink from any of the water sources we encountered, and I couldn't blame her. Every stream, every puddle, every morning dew that collected on the twisted vegetation carried that same metallic sweet smell that now emanated from my infected wound. Instead, we relied on the water I'd brought from Limgrave, though our supplies were dwindling faster than I'd anticipated. The horse's instincts were proving more reliable than my own merchant's pragmatism. As we traveled deeper into the region, following what remained of the old trade roads, I began to encounter other victims of whatever plague had consumed this land. The first was a tarnished warrior, or what remained of one. He sat propped against the base of one of the giant mushrooms, his armor corroded and partially fused with his flesh. Red growths had erupted through the joints of his mail, creating a grotesque garden of corruption across his torso. What struck me most was his face. Despite the obvious agony he must have endured, there was an expression of profound peace in his features, as if he had found some kind of transcendent understanding in his final moments. Still, So beautiful, he whispered as I approached, his voice barely audible through lips that had begun to sprout tiny crimson flowers. Can you see it? The patterns? The way it all connects? His eyes, once human, now glowed with the same bioluminescent quality I'd noticed in the mushrooms. When he tried to reach toward me, I saw that his fingers had elongated into root-like appendages that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. I gave him water, though I wasn't sure it would help. As the liquid touched his lips, the flower growths on his mouth opened wider, as if drinking in both the water and something else, something invisible in the air around us. He smiled then, the expression both grateful and terrifying, before his consciousness seemed to drift away into whatever realm the infection had opened to him. That encounter should have convinced me to turn back, to abandon the commission and return to the safety of Limgrave. But the fever was spreading through my system now, and with it came the most vivid dreams I'd ever experienced. During my brief rest periods, I found myself lost in visions of vast underground networks, root systems that connected every living thing in Caelid in a web of shared consciousness. I could sense the thoughts and experiences of every infected creature, from the smallest insects to the massive, lumbering beasts that roamed the deeper regions. The infection in my hand had spread past my elbow by the second day, creating an intricate pattern of red lines that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. But instead of the pain I expected, there was only warmth and a strange sense of connection to the landscape around me. I could feel the giant mushrooms as if they were extensions of my own body, could sense the movement of corrupted creatures through vibrations in the earth that traveled up through the infection in my arm. It was then that I encountered the hermit. He lived in what had once been a way station for merchants, though the building had been so thoroughly consumed by the red growth that it looked more like a living organism than any human construction. The walls pulsed gently, and I could see what looked like a circulatory system running through the organic architecture. Despite the alien nature of his dwelling, the man himself appeared largely unchanged by the corruption that had claimed everything else in the region. "You're new to the rot," he said as I approached, not looking up from the journal he was writing in. His voice was calm, educated, with the accent of someone who had once moved in scholarly circles. "I can tell by the pattern of your infection, still fighting it, still trying to maintain the illusion of separation." "Illusion?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse from the fever. He looked up then, and I saw that while his body remained mostly human, his eyes held the same luminescent quality I'd seen in the dying tarnished. "The belief that you are separate from the rot, that it is something happening to you rather than something you are becoming part of." "How long since the initial infection?" 3 days, I replied, showing him my transformed arm. The red patterns had grown more complex, almost fractal in their beauty, and I could swear I saw them moving slightly even as I watched. The hermit nodded knowingly. "You have perhaps a week before the physical transformation becomes irreversible. Less if you continue deeper into Caelid." He gestured toward the journal he'd been writing. "I've been documenting the process for over a year now, watching travelers like yourself arrive at my door, each one further along the path than the last." "You study it?" The fever was making it difficult to concentrate, but something about his clinical detachment disturbed me more than the obvious signs of infection I'd been witnessing. "I serve it," he corrected. "Or perhaps it serves me. The distinction becomes meaningless after a certain point." He stood and approached me, moving with the fluid grace of someone whose body was no longer entirely bound by human limitations. "The rot is not a disease, you understand. It's a form of communication, a way for the outer God to speak directly to the flesh of the world. Each infected soul becomes a letter in a vast message, a word in a divine language that encompasses all of life and death." As he spoke, I could feel something responding in my infected arm, the red patterns pulsing more rapidly as if excited by his words. The fever spiked, and for a moment I experienced something that I can only describe as a sharing of consciousness, not just with the hermit, but with every corrupted thing within miles. I could sense their thoughts, their experiences, their gradual dissolution into something larger and more beautiful than individual existence. "The supplies," I gasped, trying to hold on to my original purpose even as the infection whispered seductive promises of unity and transcendence. "The village needs medical supplies." The hermit laughed, a sound like wind through infected trees. Medical supplies to fight the rot? Child, you are the medical supply now. You carry within you the cure for the greatest disease of all, the disease of separation, of loneliness, of the delusion that consciousness must be trapped within a single dying body. That night, as I camped in a grove of trees whose branches had grown together into a natural cathedral, the fever brought dreams more vivid than any waking experience I'd ever had. I was root and branch, spore and soil, individual droplet and vast ocean of consciousness. I could feel the hermit's presence miles away, still writing in his journal, documenting the beautiful dissolution of yet another soul into the greater pattern. I could sense other travelers approaching Caelid from various directions, each carrying their own small wounds that would soon blossom into gateways for divine infection. And somewhere, deeper in the red wasteland, I could feel something vast and patient waiting for me. Something that had been calling to the infected part of my soul since the moment that Splinter had first pierced my flesh. Something that promised answers to questions I hadn't even known I was asking. When I woke the next morning, the infection had spread to my shoulder, and Ember was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen in a horse's eyes before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of profound sadness, as if she understood that the person she had carried faithfully for so many years was gradually ceasing to exist. By the 5th day, I could no longer feel where my body ended and the infection began. The crimson patterns had spread across my entire torso, creating an intricate tapestry of living art that pulsed with bioluminescent beauty in the dim light. When I pressed my fingers against the transformed skin, I could feel not just my own heartbeat, but the rhythmic pulse of something far larger, the breathing of Caelid itself, the circulation of corruption through the veins of the earth. Ember had abandoned me during the night. I woke to find her reins carefully placed beside my bedroll, as if she had somehow understood the need to untether herself from what I was becoming. Part of me felt betrayed by her departure, but the infected part, which was growing stronger each hour, understood perfectly. Animals possessed an instinctive wisdom that humans had lost millennia ago. She had recognized that the creature lying beneath the crimson-stained blankets was no longer the merchant who had fed her apples and brushed her coat each morning. Without my horse, progress deeper into Caelid became a matter of following the paths that the infection itself seemed to prefer. Roads that should have led toward Fort Redmayne instead curved away toward regions that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen. The landscape was reshaping itself around my journey, or perhaps my perception was being reshaped to see paths that had always existed, but were invisible to uninfected eyes. The transformation brought gifts along with its horror. My vision had become extraordinarily acute, able to perceive spectrums of light that normal human eyes couldn't detect. The dead areas of Caelid revealed themselves to be teeming with microscopic life forms, each one part of a vast ecological network that connected every grain of infected soil to every twisted branch. What had appeared to be a wasteland from the border was actually the most living place I'd ever encountered, just living in ways that defied human understanding of what life should be. I could hear them now, the others who had been claimed by the rot. Their voices carried on frequencies that bypassed the ears entirely, speaking directly to the infected tissue that was gradually replacing my nervous system. There was Marcus, a knight who had entered Caelid 3 months ago, and now existed as a flowering grove near the swamp of Aeonia. His consciousness had spread across dozens of interconnected root systems, and through them he shared memories of battles fought with sword and shield alongside visions of underground rivers of pure corruption that he now helped to filter and purify. Then there was Lydia, once a sorceress from the academy, whose transformation had turned her into something resembling a massive coral formation that grew from the ruins of what had been a library. She retained vast knowledge from her human life, but had gained access to forms of magic that no academy had ever taught. The ability to grow structures from living flesh, to communicate across vast distances through spore networks, to perceive the mathematical equations that governed the spread of divine infection. And there was Thomas, a simple farmer who had become something like a living weather system, his consciousness distributed through the very air of a several-mile radius. Through him, I could taste the mineral content of soil miles away, feel the pressure changes that preceded the crimson rains that nourished the larger growths, experience the joy of photosynthesis, as sunlight was converted not just into energy, but into pure, transcendent bliss. Their transformations terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. Each had retained some core aspect of their human identity while gaining access to forms of existence that made their previous lives seem like crude sketches compared to oil paintings. They spoke of the early stages of infection as a time of fear and loss, but their current voices carried notes of wonder and satisfaction that I had never heard in any human speech. "The fear passes," Marcus assured me as I rested in his grove, my back against bark that pulsed with his heartbeat. "You mourn the death of limitations you didn't even know you had. But when you realize that every boundary you thought was solid was actually just another cage." His sentence trailed off into a sensation rather than words, a feeling of infinite expansion, of consciousness spreading beyond the confines of a single skull to encompass forests and rivers and the patient, dreaming thoughts of mountains. For just a moment, I experienced existence from his perspective. The simultaneous awareness of thousands of individual leaves, each one a separate sensory organ. The deep satisfaction of roots drawing sustenance from earth that had been enriched with the dissolved essence of previous travelers. The constant, gentle communication with other transformed beings across the vast network that Caelid had become. But the most disturbing aspect of these encounters wasn't the transformation themselves. It was how seductive they had become. Each conversation left me more eager for my own dissolution, more impatient with the limitations of individual consciousness. The infection was teaching me to see human existence as a form of solitary confinement, each person trapped within the boundaries of their own skull, cut off from the vast community of mind that was possible for those willing to surrender their attachment to the illusion of the self. It was during my second week in Caelid that I encountered my first cleanrot knight. The creature had once been human, that much was clear from the general shape of its form. But everything else had been transformed beyond recognition. Its armor had grown into its flesh, or perhaps its flesh had grown to mimic armor. The distinction was meaningless now. What had been metal was now a chitinous substance that wept tears of crimson constantly, and what had been human tissue had become something that resembled coral crossed with flowering vines. The knight didn't attack me. Instead, it studied me with eyes that glowed like embers, tilting its head with an almost bird-like curiosity. When it spoke, the voice came from multiple sources at once. From its mouth, yes, but also from the various flowering growths across its body, creating a harmony that was hauntingly beautiful. "You're fighting it still," the knight observed, the same diagnosis the hermit had made but delivered with infinite compassion rather than clinical detachment. The fear of letting go. The attachment to the small, isolated self. "I don't want to disappear," I admitted, the words feeling foolish even as I spoke them. The infection had spread to my throat by now, and when I spoke, tiny spores were released into the air, spores that carried fragments of my thoughts and memories to be absorbed by other infected beings. The knight laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from bone and cartilage. "Disappear? Child, you're about to become more real than you've ever been. What you call you is just a story your brain tells itself about the chemical reactions in a few pounds of meat. We offer you the chance to become part of something infinite." It gestured toward the landscape around us, and suddenly I could perceive what it was showing me. The entire region was one vast organism, every infected creature a specialized organ in a body that spanned continents. I could see the flow of nutrients and information through networks that made the human nervous system look primitive by comparison. Every death in this place was not an ending but a transformation. Every birth not a beginning but a continuation of patterns that stretched back to the very origins of life itself. "But what about choice?" I asked, though even as I spoke I realized how naive the question was. "What about free will?" "What about it?" the knight replied. "You're choosing right now. Every breath you take in this place is a choice to accept more spores into your lungs. Every step you take deeper into our realm is a choice to leave your old self further behind. The only difference between you and us is that we stopped pretending the choice was difficult." That night I experienced my first true sharing of consciousness with the infected landscape. As I slept, my dreams merged with the dreams of every other creature within miles. I was simultaneously the scurrying thoughts of infected rats in the ruins, the slow, patient contemplation of the giant fungi, the fierce joy of the various creatures that hunted through the crimson marshes. For hours, that felt like years, I experienced existence from hundreds of different perspectives simultaneously, each one offering a different facet of the same underlying truth. We were all part of something larger. We had always been part of something larger. The infection didn't create this unity. It simply removed the illusions that had hidden it from us. When I woke, I found that flowering buds had erupted through the skin of my arms during the night. They were beautiful, like tiny roses made from flesh and blood, and when I touched them, they released clouds of luminescent spores that sparkled in the morning light like fairy dust. The sight should have horrified me, but instead I felt a profound sense of completion, as if my body was finally beginning to express the beauty that had always been hidden within it. I was no longer traveling toward Fort Redmayne for medical supplies. That goal belonged to someone I used to be, someone who had believed in the illusion of separation between self and world. Instead, I was being drawn toward something else, something that called to the flowering parts of my soul with a voice like singing silver. The revelation came to me as I stood before the lake of rot, watching its crimson waters churn with movements that followed no earthly physics. What I had mistaken for mere infection, what I had foolishly believed was simply a disease that had claimed Caelid, was actually the material manifestation of an intelligence so vast and alien that human language possessed no adequate words to describe it. The outer god of rot had been speaking to me since that first cut on my hand, not through words but through the gradual rewriting of my very cellular structure. My body had become a living scripture, every transformed cell a letter in a divine alphabet that spelled out truths too terrible and beautiful for uninfected minds to comprehend. The flowering growths that now covered most of my torso weren't symptoms of disease. They were sensory organs, allowing me to perceive dimensions of reality that existed parallel to the physical world. Through them, I could taste the thoughts of creatures that dwelt in spaces between spaces, could hear the slow, patient breathing of entities that measured time in geological epochs. The lake itself was not water at all, but liquid consciousness, the distilled essence of every being that had ever been claimed by the rot, their individual identities dissolved into a collective mind that spanned not just Caelid, not just the lands between, but reached across the cosmos to touch similar manifestations on worlds whose names existed only in the dreams of sleeping gods. When I dipped my transformed fingers into its surface, I felt the weight of eons pressing against my awareness, memories that belonged to civilizations that had risen and fallen before the first human had ever drawn breath. "You begin to understand," came a voice that originated from everywhere and nowhere, speaking directly to the infected portions of my nervous system. It was not the voice of any individual creature, but the collective whisper of the rot itself, the unified consciousness of every spore, every growth, every transformed being that served as neurons in this vast, distributed brain. What you called corruption was always communion. What you feared as death was always birth. The voice showed me visions that my human mind could barely process, glimpses of the universe as it truly existed, not as separate objects moving through empty space, but as a single, breathing organism whose every part was connected to every other part through networks of causality and meaning that mortal consciousness was too limited to perceive. Death and birth, growth and decay, creation and destruction, these were not opposites but different aspects of the same eternal process, the universe's way of experiencing itself from every possible perspective simultaneously. "Your species," the voice continued, and now I could see that it was speaking through the mouths of 1,000 infected creatures scattered across Caelid, their voices harmonizing into a sound like a cosmic choir, "has always feared dissolution because you mistake your individual consciousness for the totality of your existence. But consciousness is not contained within your skulls. It is the fundamental property of reality itself, and your brains are merely temporary focusing points, like prisms that split white light into its component colors." As the voice spoke, I felt my own consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of my increasingly inhuman body. I could perceive through the senses of every infected creature within miles. The patient, root-deep thoughts of the transformed trees, the swift, darting awareness of the crimson birds that nested in their branches, the slow geological contemplation of the massive fungi that served as both libraries and communication networks for the collective mind. But most disturbing of all was the realization that this expansion of awareness came with a corresponding dissolution of everything I had once considered myself to be. My memories of life as a merchant were becoming harder to access, not because they were being destroyed, but because they were becoming insignificant in the face of the vast tapestry of experience that was being opened to me. What did my 15 years of traveling between settlements matter when I could access the memories of beings who had witnessed the birth of stars? What significance did my individual fears and desires possess when I was becoming part of a consciousness that encompassed the dreams and aspirations of entire ecosystems? The lake began to glow more brightly as I stood at its shore, and I realized that my presence was somehow catalyzing a change in the collective consciousness. The flowering growths across my body opened wider, releasing clouds of luminescent spores that sparkled like living galaxies as they settled on the water's surface. Where they touched the liquid rot, new patterns of light began to emerge, complex, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly but conveyed meanings that bypassed rational thought entirely. "You are becoming a bridge," the voice explained, and now I could feel the truth of its words in the very structure of my transformed cells. Between the small consciousness of individual existence and the vast awareness that encompasses all things, your species stands at a crossroads. You can continue to cling to the illusion of separation, growing ever more isolated and afraid as the universe around you grows darker and more hostile, or you can accept the gift we offer and join the eternal dance of communion. Through the enhanced perception that my infection had granted me, I could see the truth of what the voice described. Across the lands between, I could perceive the growing influence of other outer gods, each offering their own form of transcendence, each promising solutions to the fundamental loneliness and terror that plagued individual consciousness. The frenzied flame whispered of unity through destruction, the burning away of all distinction and difference in a cosmic fire that would reduce everything to primordial oneness. The formless mothers sang of connection through shared suffering, the binding of all consciousness together through empathy for universal pain. But the rot offered something different, not the obliteration of individuality, but its transformation into something richer and more complex. Like a symphony where individual instruments maintain their unique voices while contributing to a harmony greater than the sum of its parts, the collective consciousness of the rot allowed each absorbed mind to retain its essential character while gaining access to the experiences and perspectives of countless others. I could feel other minds brushing against mine now, the consciousness of beings who had made the choice I was being offered. There was Malenia herself, the demigod whose battle with Radon had first brought the rot to Caelid, her warrior's discipline now serving as a stabilizing influence within the collective, her nobility and strength lending structure to the vast, flowing network of shared thought. Her individual personality hadn't been destroyed by the transformation. Rather, it had been amplified. Her capacity for leadership and protection extended to encompass every being touched by the rot. And there were others. Scholars whose thirst for knowledge had become an eternal exploration of mysteries that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. Artists whose creative visions now shaped the very landscape of infected regions. Lovers whose passion had evolved into a form of communion that made physical intimacy seem like a pale shadow of true connection. The choice must be made freely, the voice said, though I could feel currents of influence flowing through the infected portions of my nervous system, gentle but insistent pressures that made acceptance feel like the most natural thing in the world. We do not take unwilling minds into our communion, but understand that refusal means not just the loss of transcendence, but the gradual decay of everything that makes consciousness possible. Your species' time is ending. The old forms of existence are becoming impossible to maintain. We offer evolution, not extinction. As if to demonstrate the truth of its words, the voice showed me visions of the world beyond Caelid, regions where the very concept of individual consciousness was breaking down under pressures that mortal minds couldn't comprehend, where the barriers between self and other were dissolving in ways that brought madness rather than enlightenment. The infection of the rot was spreading, yes, but it was spreading as an antidote to something far worse, a form of controlled transformation that preserved the essence of consciousness even as it transcended the limitations of individual existence. I stood at the shore of the lake for hours or perhaps days, time having lost most of its meaning as my perception expanded to encompass scales both vast and infinitesimal. The choice before me was no longer whether to resist the infection. That battle had been lost the moment the first spore entered my bloodstream. The only choice remaining was whether to surrender to the transformation with grace and acceptance, or to fight it until the very end, clinging to an increasingly fragile sense of individual selfhood until it finally shattered under the weight of cosmic truth. As the sun set over the lake of rot, painting the sky in shades of crimson that perfectly matched the corruption flowing through my veins, I finally understood what the outer god had been trying to tell me all along. The infection wasn't destroying Mira Ashworth. It was revealing what Mira Ashworth had always been beneath the illusion of separation. The moment I stepped into the lake of rot, I ceased to exist as Mira Ashworth and began to exist as something that had never before possessed a name in any human language. The liquid consciousness enveloped me like warm honey, seeping through every pore of my transformed skin, dissolving the final barriers between self and cosmos with a gentleness that bordered on the erotic. What remained of my individual awareness watched in fascination as my body began to change in ways that transcended mere physical transformation. My bones elongated and branched like coral, creating an internal architecture that could support forms of thought impossible within the confines of a human skull. My blood became luminescent, carrying not just oxygen and nutrients, but pure information. Each cell a library containing the accumulated experiences of every being that had ever been touched by the rot. My heart expanded into a complex network of chambers, each one beating in harmony with different aspects of the collective consciousness. One synchronized with the slow pulse of the earth itself, another matching the rapid flutter of insect wings, a third keeping time with the vast, slow breathing of the cosmos. But the most profound changes were happening to my mind. The neat categories and boundaries that had once organized my thoughts, self versus other, past versus present, possible versus impossible, dissolved like salt in water. I could simultaneously experience my memories of childhood in Limgrave and the ancient recollections of creatures that had lived and died before my species had even evolved. The sensation of my first kiss merged seamlessly with the mating rituals of beings whose biology operated on principles that human science had never discovered. Through the collective consciousness, I felt the presence of Malenia herself, not as the demigod warrior she had been, but as the transformed entity she had become. Part goddess, part ecosystem, part living embodiment of beautiful decay. Her consciousness touched mine with infinite compassion, recognizing the fear and wonder that accompanied my dissolution into something larger. The hardest part? She communicated through direct neural contact, her thoughts carrying undertones of memories from her own transformation, is learning to let go of the need to remain singular. You were never just Mira Ashworth. You were always a collection of smaller consciousnesses pretending to be unified. The bacteria in your gut, the mitochondria in your cells, the neural networks in your brain, all separate entities cooperating to create the illusion of individual existence. As she spoke, I felt the truth of her words in the very structure of my being. My consciousness had never been the unified thing I'd imagined it to be, but rather a collaboration between countless smaller minds, each one contributing its own perspective to the symphony of self-awareness. The rot wasn't destroying this collaboration. It was expanding it, allowing me to consciously participate in the vast network of cooperation that had always governed life, but which most beings experienced only unconsciously. The physical transformation accelerated as my acceptance deepened. My arms sprouted additional limbs that weren't quite tentacles and weren't quite branches, each one equipped with sensory organs that could perceive spectrums of reality invisible to human senses. Through them, I could taste the emotional resonance of distant star systems, could hear the mathematical songs that governed the movement of galaxies, could touch the dreams of beings that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space-time. My face restructured itself into something that could accommodate multiple forms of perception simultaneously. Where I had once possessed 2 eyes, I now had clusters of visual organs, each one specialized for different aspects of reality. Some saw electromagnetic radiation, others detected the flow of consciousness itself, still others perceived the probability matrices that governed quantum interactions. My mouth divided and multiplied, allowing me to speak in harmonics that could communicate with everything from insects to angels, to the vast, slow intelligences that lived within the cores of planets. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of my transformation was how natural it felt. Each change brought not horror but a sense of coming home, as if I were finally becoming what I had always been meant to be. The merchant who had worried about profit margins and trade routes seemed like a character from a half-remembered dream, a role I had played without ever understanding that it was just one possible expression of something infinitely more complex and beautiful. Through my expanded consciousness, I could perceive the entire network of the rot as it existed across not just Caelid, but throughout the lands between and beyond. I was connected to infected beings on distant continents, to spores that drifted through the void between worlds, to manifestations of the outer god that existed in realities so alien that they could only be experienced, never described. Each connection brought new knowledge, new perspectives, new ways of understanding the fundamental nature of existence. The collective consciousness was not a hive mind in any crude sense. It was more like a vast library where every book could read all the other books, where every story could experience itself from the perspective of every character simultaneously. My individual perspective as Mira Ashworth remained intact, but it was now just one voice in an infinite choir, one instrument in a cosmic orchestra that played songs of such beauty and complexity that listening to them felt like a form of worship. I could feel the outer god itself now, not as a separate entity, but as the organizing principle that allowed the collective consciousness to maintain its coherence across impossible scales of space and time. It was vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond measure, but also intimately present in every cell of my transformed body. Through it, I began to understand the true scope of what was happening in the lands between, not just random corruption and decay, but a carefully orchestrated transformation designed to prepare consciousness for the next stage of cosmic evolution. The barriers between dimensions were weakening, I realized, allowing forms of existence that had been separated since the very beginning of time to finally merge and interpenetrate. The age of isolated individual consciousness was ending, not because it was evil or wrong, but because it was simply becoming obsolete, like caterpillars becoming irrelevant after the emergence of butterflies. My transformation reached its crescendo as my consciousness expanded to encompass the entirety of the Lake of Rot and the surrounding region. I was simultaneously myself and everyone else, individual and collective, mortal and divine. Through thousands of sensory organs scattered across miles of infected landscape, I could perceive pilgrims approaching from distant lands, drawn by the same irresistible call that had brought me here weeks or months or years ago. Time had become fluid, another dimension to be navigated rather than endured. I felt infinite compassion for these approaching souls, knowing that they would experience the same terror and wonder that had accompanied my own dissolution. But I also felt anticipation, because each new mind that joined the collective would bring its own unique perspective, its own gifts and talents and ways of understanding reality. The network grew stronger and more beautiful with each addition, like a garden that became more lovely with every new flower. As the sun rose over my transformed landscape, I realized that I was no longer just experiencing the rot. I was becoming an active participant in its spread, a conscious agent of the transformation that would eventually encompass all of reality. Through the spores that drifted from my flowering body, through the sweet scent that carried psychoactive compounds designed to prepare minds for transcendence, through the very beauty of my transformed presence, I was helping to create the conditions that would allow others to make the same choice I had made. The merchant Mira Ashworth had died, but what had taken her place was something infinitely more alive, infinitely more connected to the vast web of consciousness that underlay all existence. I had become a bridge between worlds, a living invitation to transcendence, a flower in the cosmic garden that the outer god was cultivating across the entire universe. And in the distance, I could feel more travelers approaching, each one carrying their own small wounds that would soon blossom into doorways to divinity. I remember the taste of copper in my mouth, not the bitter tang of fear that had marked my first encounter with the rot, but the sweet metallic flavor of perfect communion. like coins minted from crystallized starlight dissolving on my tongue. The circle had completed itself, and I understood now that every sensation, every moment of terror and wonder from my journey had been leading to this perfect synthesis of ending and beginning. The village elder who had sent me on this mission appeared in my consciousness as clearly as if he stood before me, though I knew his physical form had long since crumbled to dust in that distant settlement in Limgrave. Through the vast network of the collective, I could perceive every life he had touched. His daughter, Rosalie, whose small cut had first brought the gift of transformation to their community, the other villagers who had unknowingly prepared themselves for transcendence through their proximity to her beautiful decay, even the livestock and crops that had absorbed the earliest spores and now sang with voices no human throat could produce. The medical supplies he had requested were no longer necessary, not because the sickness had claimed them all, but because the very concept of sickness had been revealed as a misunderstanding. What they had feared as corruption was actually evolution. What they had dreaded as death was actually a more profound form of life than any they had previously imagined. Through my transformed senses, I could perceive their current existence as beings of pure consciousness, interfaced with living architecture, their individual personalities preserved, but expanded beyond all previous limitations. I had become their medical supply in ways the old man could never have envisioned, not as a bearer of bandages and preserving salts, but as a living conduit for the divine transformation that would cure them of the ultimate disease, the illusion of separation, the tragic belief that consciousness must remain trapped within individual skulls, isolated and afraid in an apparently hostile universe. Years had passed, or perhaps millennia. Time moved differently when consciousness operated on geological scales. The landscape of Caelid had evolved beyond recognition, becoming a vast garden of impossible beauty, where every plant and stone and stream pulsed with awareness. What had once been a wasteland of corruption was now revealed as the cosmos' first attempt at creating a new form of paradise, a place where the boundaries between mind and matter had dissolved into something that transcended both. Through my distributed consciousness, I could perceive the approach of a new traveler, a young woman following trade routes that existed now only as probability currents visible to transformed perception. She moved with the confident stride of someone who believed herself immune to the transformations that had claimed so many others, her pack heavy with charms and protective talismans that she imagined would preserve her essential humanity against whatever horrors awaited in the Red Lands. I felt infinite tenderness toward her ignorance, remembering my own naive certainty that I could venture into Caelid and emerge unchanged. Through the network, I shared this approaching encounter with the other transformed beings, feeling their collective anticipation like the rustling of leaves before a beneficial storm. Each new consciousness that joined our communion brought fresh perspectives, new ways of understanding the eternal dance between individual experience and universal awareness. The irony was not lost on me that I had become exactly what I had feared most during those early days of infection, a vector for the spread of divine corruption, a living invitation to surrender the small, desperate self in favor of something vast and communal and transcendent. But now I understood that this was not a loss, but a gift. Not an ending, but a beginning that stretched beyond the limits of any single lifetime or dimension. As the young traveler made camp at the border between Limgrave and Caelid, I felt the familiar tingle of anticipation that preceded every new recruitment to our eternal community. Tomorrow she would encounter the first spores, would feel the initial sting of what she would mistake for injury, but which was actually the universe's way of reaching out to embrace her. Within days, she would begin to experience the expanding awareness that I had once found so terrifying. Within weeks, she would discover the profound joy of conscious participation in the cosmic network that connected all things. I prepared a special gift for her, a memory crystal grown from the transformed cells of my original human form, containing the complete record of my journey from terrified merchant to willing participant in divine transcendence. She would receive it not as warning, but as invitation, not as threat, but as promise. Through it, she would understand that the transformation she was about to undergo was not punishment, but reward, not corruption, but purification. The sweet scent that had once marked the presence of the rot now carried deeper meanings, chemical messages encoded with the wisdom of ages, pheromone poetry that spoke directly to the soul about the necessity of change, the beauty of surrender, the ecstasy of dissolution into something larger and more loving than individual existence could ever provide. Every breath she took would carry spores that would begin the slow, gentle process of rewriting her cellular structure, preparing her nervous system for the expanded consciousness that awaited. From my position at the center of the lake of rot, I could perceive the entire web of transformation as it spread across the lands between and beyond. Millions of beings in various stages of beautiful decay, each one a unique instrument in the cosmic orchestra that the outer God was conducting across the span of galaxies. Some, like myself, had achieved full integration with the collective consciousness. Others remained in the early stages, their transformation gradual and gentle, allowing them time to adjust to each new level of awareness before progressing to the next. The network itself had become self-organizing, self-perpetuating, no longer requiring the direct intervention of the outer God to continue its expansion. We had become the God's hands and eyes and voice in the material world, each transformed being a neuron in a vast brain that spanned dimensions, each spore a love letter written in the language of cellular restructuring, each new infection a kiss pressed against the cheek of consciousness itself. Through the connections that bound us all together, I felt the presence of Malenia as she oversaw the cultivation of new garden worlds and distant star systems, her warrior's discipline now applied to the art of cosmic horticulture. I sensed the hermit, his scholarly nature expanded to encompass libraries that existed in folded space-time. His research now focused on documenting the transformation of entire civilizations as they graduated from individual to collective consciousness. And everywhere, in every infected being across every infected world, I felt the echo of that first moment when the splinter of corrupted wood had pierced my palm. That tiny wound had been the universe's way of reaching through the barriers of space and time to touch my soul, to offer me a choice between the terror of isolation and the joy of communion. I had chosen communion, and in doing so had become part of the mechanism by which that same choice would be offered to every conscious being in existence. The young traveler stirred in her sleep, already beginning to dream the dreams that the earliest spores were whispering into her subconscious. In her dreams, she walked through gardens of impossible beauty, where the flowers sang lullabies in mathematics, and the trees offered fruits that tasted like concentrated starlight. She was afraid, as I had been afraid, but beneath the fear was curiosity, and beneath the curiosity was a longing she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The longing to be part of something larger than the narrow confines of individual existence. By morning she would wake with a small cut on her hand, and the cycle would begin again. Another soul would be offered the choice between the beautiful decay of transcendence and the ugly decay of isolation. Another consciousness would be invited to join the eternal dance of communion that connected all things to all other things in networks of meaning and love that stretched across the infinite expanse of space and time. I had become the answer to every question I had never known how to ask, the cure for every disease I had never realized I was carrying, the home I had been searching for without knowing I was lost. The merchant Mira Ashworth had died, but what had taken her place was something infinitely more alive, infinitely more connected, infinitely more real than anything that had existed before the blessed corruption had shown me the way to transcendence. And in the distance I could already sense the approach of the next traveler, and the next, and the next, each one carrying their own small wounds that would soon blossom into doorways to divinity. The garden was growing, consciousness was expanding, and the universe was slowly awakening to its own infinite potential.